on that. Good day to you, Simon. Thank you very much for joining us. You know, when I first heard the story and the quote, "I can't breathe," I actually thought they were talking about the Eric Garner incident, where an unarmed black man, Eric Garner, was held by police in 2014 and he died in a similar fashion.
Yeah, it is absolutely extraordinary that the last words of Eric Garner and the last words of George Floyd are the same. I can't breathe. And on both occasions, the police involved in attempts to arrest them for relatively minor offences. In the case of Eric Garner, illegally selling cigarettes on the streets of New York. In the case of George Floyd, suspected forgery. Those police officers did not listen to what the suspects were saying. We've got some breaking news, though, Sally, that has literally just been announced in the state of Minnesota. Derek Chauvin, the police officer that can be seen in that videotape with his knee pressing down on George Floyd's neck during the attempted arrest last weekend, has now been taken into custody by police. We don't yet know what criminal charges he will be facing. There have been widespread calls for him and other members of that police unit that was deployed to arrest Mr. Floyd to be facing charges of murder. But literally within the last few minutes, the police in Minneapolis have announced that officer has now been taken into custody. It has taken them an astonishing, one has to say it, an astonishing 96 hours to arrest the officer after they fired him and 3 of his colleagues in the immediate aftermath of that viral video being released on social media showing the circumstances that led up to George Floyd's death. But after 3 nights of violent protests in Minneapolis, including the torching of a police station in the city last night by demonstrators absolutely furious that no arrests had yet been made in the case, well, finally, within the last few minutes, at least 1 arrest has been made. Again, we'll wait and see what charges are being brought against that officer, and we'll wait to see whether other members of that unit are also being taken into custody.
Now, Simon, I understand that Donald Trump has called in the National Guard, and also I hear that today the 911 call that led to police going out has been released. Can you tell us more about that?
I haven't actually heard the 911 call yet, Sally, but as you're aware, there were so many onlookers on the ground as George Floyd was being arrested and restrained by those officers, and all the onlookers, all of them, and some of them were black, some of them were white, they came a rainbow of colours on display in that crowd, were saying to the police officers, listen to him, he's telling you he can't breathe. I mean, that phrase alone, as you were suggesting, is so redolent of brutal treatment being meted out by white police officers to minority suspects. And members of the crowd urged the police to ease up in their treatment of Mr. Floyd, one of them saying, why don't you just stand him up? At least you could let him stand up. They already had him handcuffed at that point. Not only did the officers ignore the remonstrations of the crowd, at one point the police officers threatened the crowd with pepper spray, all of this being filmed on multiple cell phones, of course, by onlookers, all of whom immediately uploaded those scenes to social media, which is why this has become such an intense and frankly tinderbox situation, not just in the city of Minneapolis, but elsewhere.
And we also understand that a CNN crew was arrested. They've now been released, but they were arrested live on air trying to cover the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, extraordinary situation. A black reporter for CNN, Omar Jimenez, this morning at dawn with his team find themselves just in front of police lines as police were starting to move people out of the area where the demonstrations had taken place overnight. He very calmly and very politely asks the police where they would like him to stand. He and his team are ready to move. Where would you like us to go? Not only do they provide no answer, they then arrest Mr. Jimenez and his entire team. stream, the whole thing seen live on American television, an absolutely clear, flagrant breach of the reporter's First Amendment constitutional rights to engage in free speech and protected journalism on the scene in Minneapolis. He was only released after the intervention of the governor of Minnesota. And astonishingly, this black reporter for CNN was arrested before any of the police officers who were actually involved in the incident that led to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis back on Monday over the Memorial Day weekend. President Trump is going to be holding a press conference here in Washington in about 35 minutes' time. As you know, he has been very voluble on this issue on Twitter over the last few hours. Let's wait to see what he has to say when he appears in the Rose Garden of the White House.
Yes, I mean, he was saying when the looting starts, so referring, of course, to the protests that have occurred in the wake of the mishandling of this case with George Floyd. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. How's that gone down?
Yeah, let's be absolutely clear what he was saying in that tweet. He was threatening to send the National Guard into Minneapolis, which he's now doing, and he was sending a message to protesters. If you start looting, the National Guard will start shooting. And that phrase, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, he didn't make that phrase up. That phrase was first used here by a racist white police chief in the city of Miami in 1967, a man by the name of Walter Headley, a very famous phrase that resonates appallingly with African Americans all over the country. At the time, in 67, he was issuing a warning to black protesters who were planning to lay siege to the Republican Party's convention in Miami. It is far from coincidence that Donald Trump used that particular phrase in that tweet earlier today, and Twitter, as you know, branded that tweet with a warning saying that it glorified violence, adding to the declaration of war that we heard yesterday from President Trump on Twitter when he signed an executive order accusing the social media platform of trying to censor him.
Simon Marks in Washington, thank you very much for that update. And of course, just a recap of that breaking news coming from Washington at this time. Officer Derek Chauvin, who is the officer that can be seen in that video putting his knee on to George Floyd's neck, has finally been taken into custody.